Hello everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today we're doing something a little bit different from normal, as you might be able to tell. You see, for a while now I have been wanting to share other forms of art on this channel. I do this entire thing because I find it fun, and because I wanted to start sharing my art and the process that I took along the way. Since then, I've only really looked at digital art and sharing that. As, yes, at first I went through a phase of it. I quite enjoyed digital art for a while, and it was everything that I was producing there for a short bit. I then got a little bit stuck in those ideas and sharing only them since it was the easiest that I could do, and it was also the one that I'd become accustomed to filming and sharing, and I got to know the process a bit more. I wasn't sure how to share anything else with the setup that I have or the space that I had at the time, and I just stuck with the digital art, and I continued down that, always wanting to share other processes and other things that I do, but never quite taking that step. So then here we are, the first step of a brand new learning curve, so I apologise in advance for any issues in this video. There's probably going to be quite a few. As I already know that this room is quite echoey for now, and I am looking to change that. But we're taking the first step, and I do want to share more physical art as well with you, as I enjoy both. I enjoy this, painting, and I honestly am now looking at my shelf of art supplies that I haven't touched for a while, and different forms of art that I've just overlooked in favour of digital. So I'm taking this step, and today we're doing something a bit different. So, with that said, what about the art for today? Today we're looking at a painting, an acrylic painting, and I've actually got it here behind me as I started it a few weeks ago. So, see, a few weeks ago, I was looking at skeleton ideas and people, as it's been a fair minute since I looked at those inspirations. This is where I got the skeletal idea from in that video that I did a few weeks ago, and I really enjoyed that process. But that sketch actually came from this development, just here. One night, I was sketching and I had this canvas that I wanted to paint over because the drawing on this before was just never going to get finished. It was an idea that I felt was cool at the time, but lost my motivation for, and it wasn't really giving the message that I wanted it to portray. So I painted over it. I just kind of painted the canvas black and called it a day. Until I then, of course, found my chalk and started sketching out this from my sketchbook. This has its own thing that we're going to get into later with a few voiceovers. However, I started it, sketched it out, and then got to this point with the blue and a flower done down here, and I didn't touch it for the following few weeks. I've not touched it since I did this part, and most of this was done in one night. Well, I say one night, but it was more like a few. I want to say one or two. It was close together, is what I'm trying to say. So today, and for the next however long it takes me to make this video, I'm going to hold myself accountable and finally finish this piece. I'm just going to get it done, and I'm actually going to dedicate time to working on it, rather than making myself work digitally or on anything else instead. I kind of have a rule with myself that I will only have so many projects on the go at once, and this one is stopping me from starting another painting. So it's about time that I actually look back at this, and you're going to come along for the ride. So, with all of that being said, let's just kind of get into it. Let's get into all of that, and I will hand you over to the voiceover, where I'm going to be discussing what I was doing with this, and we might just end up checking in again later. So then, isn't this a bit more familiar for us? I'm used to doing this a bit more, so let's just kind of get into it and waffle about the drawing itself then, shall we? The first thing that I want to discuss here is the start of the painting, since Well, it's fairly obvious. I don't have any footage of this one starting out, since I didn't plan to record it, and I wasn't really sure if I would go down this route for this video, or if I would even share this painting at all. Obviously, as well, here we are, and all of this is being shared and we're here with this video. So let's kind of look at the actual processes that got us to this point. The ideas and the smaller choices for details will be covered in a later section, as I'll kind of talk about them when I can get into the main bulk of everything, and it isn't too relevant at the moment. So then, starting out with this canvas, there had originally been another painting on it below. I started that other idea months ago at this point, and it kind of got to a point where the face was a bit strange and the hands weren't what they were supposed to be, and it kind of reached a point where I just wasn't feeling the inspiration for it anymore. I could have pushed on and insisted that I finished it, but I could hardly recall why I wanted to make that painting in the first place, or what my goal had been. The inspiration had passed, and I couldn't really say that I was excited for it anymore. And don't get me wrong, the idea that originally was on this canvas is still living on in one of my sketchbooks somewhere, and even then that is an older sketchbook than the one that I'm currently using. So it isn't like I will never revisit that idea should I get that urge to, or remember what I was trying to do with it. Yet, for now, it wasn't sparking anything, and there wasn't something making me want to go back to it. So it kind of was just sat in the hallway at the top of the stairs for months, getting in people's way. It got to a point where I even had chalked over it to try and work out a different composition for that image, or was trying to fix the face here and the hands there. And it ended up just facing the wall so I didn't have to look at it. But at first, I kind of figured that I could always paint over this, and then I'd come up with the idea for it later. I just wanted the old painting gone. I actually did intend to do that as well, as I decided this idea late at night, and I'd set out to kind of repaint it the next day. And this was kind of just as a way for me to change my mind should I want to in the end. However, by the next day, I had the sketches for a skeletal idea, and I had the themes already starting to form. I had the competition between this and a range of other options and focal points, and I kind of just had the urge to look at life and death again via the use of skeletons, since this is an idea that I often come back to. Of course, in this as well, I still had to pick out which one it would be and which one that I would actually use, and I kind of figured that I'd work it all out as I had to. I wouldn't rush myself or force it, but I had a wide variety of ideas at play. I kind of inferred that I would want a black or dark background for the new painting, and I would kind of work with that sort of undertone. So, like I often choose to, I painted over the old one to make way for the new, and I painted over it in the dark colour, so I kind of saved myself a bit of a step. This is then where our process for this drawing itself actually begins. I had to take a step back and kind of let the base layer dry, and so I felt that I would use that time to come up with the idea that I would actually be pursuing, and kind of looking at what the shape of the canvas itself would allow. I had a few ideas that revolved around hands and the skeletal structures there, but I decided that the proportion of the canvas wasn't enough for what I had in mind, or if I had continued with it, it might have been a bit weird. I would have likely needed a canvas a bit taller to wider than this one is, so I would have had to refit the idea to the page, and it didn't really work. So this means that I changed routes, and I looked at the idea of a skull on its own. Yet decided then that I would have needed a canvas simply a bit smaller to convey this idea how I wanted it to be. For this canvas, there was simply too much space when all things were being considered, and it didn't sit right that I would try and force it. So by all of this, and by process of elimination, I had the ribs and the spine or a pile of bones. The pile of bones idea got eliminated as it no longer spoke to me like the other ones did. It read a lot more as simple decay, or possibly even referring to archaeology before anything else. And I kind of wanted to keep with the themes that I had in mind. I didn't really know what the painting would say if it read simply as death, or even archaeology. So this then left me with the spine and ribs, which were two very similar ideas. In the end of this, the ribs won because of personal bias and little more. I felt that they were fun, and I thought that it would be interesting to look at this before all else. And I kind of wanted to explore what I could do with them differently to the ideas that I've addressed in the past. It also took up a bit more of horizontal space, and had a more sense of interaction with the environment that I kind of didn't have with the spine. I wanted there to be an interaction, and I'd already planned to surround the bones to truly deliver on the theme at hand. And the ribs worked better. Don't get me wrong, with the spine it was all present, but it was also felt a bit disconnected. There was more a sense and feeling of decay to the image, yet there wasn't much beyond that. It felt like, if looking at it, the body had decayed and been reclaimed by nature, and the plants around had already begun to spiral and wrap around the spine and connecting structures. And it kind of presented itself as an anchor for growth more than anything. Yes, it still looked at life and death, but not in the same way that I was in the mood for. I kind of wanted to look at them both together, side by side. Not so much what the spine had been reading as, which read more as reclaimed life, or the life that continues after the loss and after death. It is a way that I enjoy looking at this theme, but not the one that I wanted for today. I also wanted to be a bit selfish and include elements of a figure in the piece, like I did with another painting that I did in the past. And this is the way that I did it. Now then, this is where, as I previously said, I drew the idea out with chalk, and then started laying out the colours seen at the start. Of these 2 points, there is really only one that I feel the need to actually explain at the current moment. Both will absolutely have their moments, but the colours will be a little bit more to cover before the next check-in, so for now, at the very least, I want to address the sketching phase before all else. I know commonly people draw it out in pencil, a white pencil or coloured pencil perhaps, yet pencil either way, and kind of work around matters that it comes up with. It is something that I have done and still do in many cases, and it simply makes sense to approach it in this manner. It's the most direct, of course. Yet the chalk is a habit that I developed during art at college, where I often would work with a very dark background. Not much changing there. And I only really had a pastel or chalk at hand to work with when I didn't have a white pencil. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely could have continued to use pencil for these sketches with the dark background, as we did have pencils all over the place. It was kind of an art room, so graphite pencils were in no shortage. However, I often found that I gave myself a headache when doing this. The graphite would only appear on the dark background under certain lights, and the light in the room often changed or became blocked by other people, so it wasn't the most reliable. I would also make mistakes only visible at the later stages of painting, and when all was said and done, it was just more work than it was using another material that I had on hand, or that I could bring in. I also did try white pencil at certain points, but I came to favour chalk as my process, as I found that it would wipe away with the paint as I worked on it, and if it didn't by some chance, I could always wash it off later with a little bit of water when I was done with everything, or if it got in my way. It let me change a lot more in the process as I went, and I could make corrections as I needed to, since I often found pencil was hard to rub out and I would get confused with which line was right and which one was wrong, until it was just a bit too late and it was more of a headache to try and fix. Chalk was simple, it made sense, and it's something that I have used on dark backgrounds ever since. There also isn't really a downside that I haven't been able to work around yet. Another benefit of the chalk that I quite enjoy is that, on a dark background like this, I can always manipulate it to mirror shading or lighting in the image to kind of get a sense of what I want the later points to be as well. And, like the outlines, it will still vanish when it actually comes to working on different sections like it was never even there. For this one especially, A lot of the flowers began with a sense of this, and I planned out the ribs using smudged chalk before anything else. And then at the end I just went back in and removed the middle sections for those tones. And that was before painting, since I felt that it would work better in the end by doing this. Yet with all of this, it gave me a point where I could also look at working on it and developing it into what I would end up with. Now, just quickly here, you will note a bit of a jump in progress with the video. It was around here that I had quite a few technical issues after all. The first was that I recorded the check-in as a sort of mid-video update on the progress here, yet I found that during editing that portion of the audio and the video, the sound was just unusable. The room is very echoey at the moment, so all of the video I have been having audio issues and working around them the best I can. Yet I wasn't happy with the issues, and I couldn't ignore them or overlook them. I couldn't really just write it off as, say, teething issues and call it a day. So the update isn't here. Though then, in addition to this, I also lost an evening's recordings where I had made little bits of progress. I don't really know how I lost the clips. I might have simply forgotten to hit the record button as I worked on it. Yet this session was done later in the evening over the weekend, so it's a very plausible series of events that I thought I pressed it when I simply didn't, and then I just didn't check like I should have. So I suppose that this one will just have to be filed away under oops. There wasn't much that I missed when all things were really considered, but it was the part of the process where I had been starting to work on the skin of the figure, and I had been trying to detail it or work out how I would be pursuing it. I only made a little bit of progress when all things are really put into perspective, since I was really only able to lay down the base of what I would be continuing later. The session itself was a shorter one where I really only worked for an hour and a half, since I wasn't quite happy with how it was going, and I decided in the end to just do something else instead. Though also in this missing section, I worked a bit more on the background behind the figure to try and work out what would be going there, as I was no longer quite satisfied at the idea of keeping it plain. I had ideas that I would add wisps of colour and lines of light coming from the ribs, rather than the original idea of moss and growth on them, so I kind of felt that I wanted to blend this into the environment that little bit, and just give it a sense of coherence this way. A lot of water later, and I had the background for the most part, and then I worked into sections with more black to create the needed areas of contrast, and then other sections saw more yellow and lilacs added into it, until I was genuinely happy with the effect. So then, this is where the other clips will be picked up from given small mishap. Though the details of this will likely come later with everything else, as, for now, I still have part of the development to discuss, as to even get to this point I had to work out the colour palette for everything. This stage also mattered a little bit more than it usually would in one of my videos. I mean, in my digital work, a colour palette isn't really any sort of commitment, or something that's set in stone until the drawing is done. They're very easy to change, and with the right trick, you don't even have to redo any shading or effects on an area when you change the colours around. When painting, this is rather the opposite situation. It is possible to change your mind later in the painting if you don't like a colour, but it's a little bit more of a headache if you want to be drastically different. I could easily make sections seem lighter or darker as needed via the shading and the environment around them. But if I decided when done that red would work better for the skin, or that I wanted to swap the flowers and the skin tones in the palette, then I would basically be repainting this from square one. All of this is to say that I needed to think it through and work it out before I started, given the details I knew I would want. I knew I wanted purple in the palette and hints of blue or green. I kind of knew that the green would come through regardless, given the overgrown elements that I'd planned and intended from the start. Purple would work well for the ribs, and selfishly, I like how it looks when I have done it before. so I kind of knew that the purple would also be a bit less negotiable. This all gave me a starting point to work from quite naturally. Purple meant that blue would pair well with it, and the blue could also help tilt the imagery away from the realistic impressions, as it is very rare that I work with those, if I ever have either. Yet I also knew from the start that I could use turquoise or teal that lent more towards the green side of the scales. And this was just so it would remain coherent with the plants and the base at the lower part of the image. I figured at this point that the flowers could be contrast to this. I could focus on them with reds and pinks to make them feel a bit warmer and more alive, and, at this point, began planning how to almost make them seem more alive with stronger tones and brighter contrast. For now though, I made a note of it on my phone, and kind of mocked up a few digital ideas for it, and then got to work laying it out as is seen. It is also worth noting that for my base tone, I chose black. For context here, the underpainting or the underlayer can often influence how the colours will look in the end, as it will show through thinner areas of paint, or if there are any gaps between the strokes. Pure white often stands out like a sore thumb in my work, though I do know some people who can make it work for them. Otherwise, I have also seen browns as a popular tone for the base, and I have seen people use all sorts. I've seen artists who use bright pink, lilac blues, and all sorts to kind of help them create the effect that they later want in their work, and to just give it the overall hue. So, with all of that said, why did I go with black out of everything that I could have chose? Well, the answer to this is quite simply that I wanted most things to be dark in the image, and I wanted a strong sense of contrast. I didn't want it to be overly bright, and any warm tones wouldn't have fit right either. I also find that, for ideas like this, the black makes the brighter colours look better and stronger, as it also lets me make darker areas more subtle overall. For this situation, I used it as a complete background as I have mentioned, and I did this knowing that it would impact the painting, and that I might come to regret it later. However, I wanted the figure to be dark and the flowers to be bright. It is an experiment since I usually would keep things fairly similar in terms of value, or I would make the focal points darker but noticeable. I knew the ribs would stand out with their structure and the effects that I intended to create with them, the light and shadows that I planned to add. But the flowers would be vibrant, and I wanted to see how this all would affect the figure in the long run. If I hate it, then I hate it, and I'll revisit the skin later to adjust as needed, and I'll fix it as I go. I mean, being honest, I wasn't happy when I started shading the skin, as it gave me lists of troubles, but I found that I could work with it. I added the red to the skin as something a bit different, a tone that stands out yet adds interest to it overall, as the other routes just weren't working. Might I still go back and change this? We will simply have to see by the time that I finish the painting, since at the time of writing this script, I still have flowers to finish before I make that choice. Anyway though, moving on through the process, we then reached what I will call the ugly stage. This was part way through the skin's details, where I wasn't sure which way it would go, and I didn't really know how to fix it. This is the part of the process where I felt like I forgot how to paint, despite how much I've done it before, and it felt like everything I knew was wrong, or that it wasn't working. Again, it's why I say that this is likely something I would revisit if I needed to, just so that I could fix what I don't like about it. But even in saying that, the ugly phase is part of most drawings. For this one, I had a break from it, and I came back the next day. I added the red and liked it, and it kind of made me feel like it had potential, but was also something that I liked as a whole for this moment too. Doing that little bit to it and adding there kind of spurred me back to this drawing, and kind of let me feel like I'd finished that section, so I could move on. And that was so I wasn't going to get endlessly caught up in it, or endlessly chase the perfection with it. Perfection is needed at times, attention to detail can be good, but these things can also hinder and be a detriment to the process in the painting I've found all too often, since it commonly leads to me overworking an area, or just simply spending too much time fussing over things that don't matter in the long run. I suppose that if I really need to, I can always revisit it later, even if it is after this video has been shared. But being able to move on to the ribs and turn away from all of that kind of helped me push through the ugly phase, since I could then detail the ribs as I needed to and continue to add where I wanted everything else to be. Now though, with all of that said, the painting process is fairly direct from there, or it's full of stages where I can't explain what I did, since I kind of just did it and I didn't make note of anything to mention. Painting as a whole is one of those things where, whenever I try it, the process changes as I go, and I can hardly explain what I did or why it worked once I've done it. So let's look at the details of this piece then, and actually start to explain some of my choices there, as they do seem fairly key to the painting where the focus is more on the idea to it, not so much the story or a narrative. The first detail that I want to discuss here for this painting is why I keep coming back to these ideas and these themes and kind of continue to explore human figures with skeletal pieces. It will sound strange, yet I've often been interested by the theme of death and kind of tying it into decay, but this is also often with how they overlap and remain present in life and the daily motions. I kind of like the way that the two sides of the balance exist together, and the small ways that they interact with each other. By this, I mean the ways that life is given meaning by some in its ultimate end. I also mean the way that life can encompass nature and the world's ability to regrow after disturbance or tragedy, or simple abandonment. I like how nature reclaims all eventually, and the fact that death is another part of this cycle. In the same breath, I like how the stories people tell about death to explain it, or to try and make it less intimidating and unknown, these often being myths and beliefs of the afterlife that give people comfort or answers. There are stories of ghosts and other remaining impressions of the dead with a purpose to them, this either being tales of vengeful spirits with final injustices, or those of spirits remaining to care and watch over the living. The way that these two things are so connected and opposite is something that I've always been interested in, and there are conversations to be had about it that never have the chance to be had or to unfold. So I explore it via art. I got the chance to do this in college as well, with one of the units that I was able to tie in this connection with, given the theme for me to explore. And by doing this, it let me explore that theme how I wanted to, since I also felt the other theme wasn't going to give me much space to move. I chose to explore the theme using images of statues that I merged with pictures of a skeleton for that module, and I created my favourite painting to date as the final outcome. The images were taken from a class trip for the statues, and then I borrowed the science department's skeleton for a few minutes, before editing these two sets of imagery together, and I love how just the photo editing from that one turned out, and then later the paintings. Since then, it's kind of created a spark for this sort of exploration that I feel like I haven't fully developed yet. The first route saw me statues as a theme of memory. Statues are an older form of art, and they're something that can be dedicated to a story or a person to keep memory of it alive. And it's not necessarily an old form of art that isn't done anymore. What I mean by that is it's one with a very rich and vibrant and long history. And a lot of statues do commonly commemorate history or a person or a story. And this can kind of be viewed as a sort of betrayal of death in a sense. as the memory continues on keeping part of the figure alive. Yet, I wouldn't consider it a true betrayal of death, since the version of the person living on via memory is likely to warp and twist away from the complex being that they once were. They become a figure from a story, not so much a living person. The idea, if you will, decays slightly. And this is where I added the skeletal feature into it originally. Naturally, I then figured that this has endless potential to explore, so I keep coming back to it, and this time was no different. I wanted to combine a figure with the skeleton since I wanted to combine the idea of living and decaying. This one isn't intended to be a statue. I was using a reference from a living person for it, but I still wanted to explore how these things can very often coexist, for better and for worse. This is also why I removed part of the face, and the most recognisable features from the head. It wasn't meant to have any sort of personal identity, as it isn't something that only a few people face, or it isn't something that only happens to certain groups of people. Death, dare I say it, is often universal. It may be slightly more present in some lives than others, or it might be treated with varying attitudes. But the core of the idea is still present all over, so it would lack a single face. I instead felt that it would be more fitting that this would be a section with part of the reclaiming details in it, to kind of really highlight the tie between them. So, speaking of this, I do want to touch on the natural plants in the image and the idea of reclaiming by nature. I mean, I went with this idea over the spine since it had elements of life, death, and the theme of things being reclaimed by nature in the end, but I did kind of draw back on this as I went. Originally, I was going to add moss to the ribs, and I had planned to include more themes to the image of reclaiming, with the way that the two areas were interacting and overlapping. I wanted moss, cracks in the ribs, and maybe even vines between the ribs, as if they were growing over the space. However, I noticeably didn't do this in the end. I instead added wispy lines coming from inside the cavity, in quite light colours but nothing too light. I kept them as broken up lines and decided to add them on a whim, something that I just kind of tried before I overthought them and before I could change my mind, since I sort of figured that I wouldn't know if I liked it until I did it. I thought that it would ultimately add to one of the present themes and be a bit stronger than what I already had. And the wisps were a small detail otherwise that sat between everything else. Naturally, I kept it because I liked it, and I figured that this kind of kept things with a sense of interaction, but it didn't have as much of an overlap, if that makes any sort of sense. By this, I mean that the moss would have read as a lot of overlap, decay causing regrowth, and it would have read more as the processes after decay has occurred. It would look like a depiction of the cycle, which is still one of the current interpretations to it, but not the one that I painted with in mind. I instead prefer this approach with the wispiness, where they interact, but there isn't as much of an overlap. The flowers are their own thing and the figure is another, and the wisps in the middle are kind of just a point of interest, and they help guide the eye. The wisps made the figure a bit more noticeable, however, I didn't want them to stand out too much. You see, the flowers here represent life, growth, but also tie into ideas of rebirth, change, and loss. I at least referenced the shape of the flowers that meant it to begin with, yet I changed my plans as I went since I didn't want to strictly paint them from the pictures, and I kind of went more with what fit the piece and fit the moment. Yet, besides all of this, I painted with the flowers to stand out. This might be a bit backwards for a moment, yet the focal point is meant to be the figure with the skeletal theme present. I want that to be the part of the image that carries the most meaning. Yet, when painting the flowers, I kind of purposefully made them brighter and more vibrant than the person, I did this as they carry the impression of life in the outcome, and they are meant to be flourishing and alive despite their proximity to the decay. Brighter colours tend to associate more with life in people's minds, and dull or darker colours with decay and death. The brighter colours in this case grab people's attention. They distract almost in this circumstance. In terms of common attitudes, people like to forget about death and the end of anything more likely than not. It's easier for most, and it kind of lets people function without worry more often than the alternative. In relation to this, it is also more common to find people with negative views of death, or to find someone who fears it rather than embraces it. There are still many places in the world that will use death to celebrate life, or that will view it as a sort of transition to the next stage. But where I live and with the people I know, it is something never discussed. So I kind of wanted to reflect that in this painting. The bold colours demand the eye's attention first. When working on this, it is what people have been drawn to commenting on first when I ask for opinions, and it is also where people look first. They see that, they appreciate it, and then they notice the figure. They are so distracted by the vibrancy and the brightness of the life in the work that they don't first notice the elements of death, or the fact that the flowers could even tie into it. This is exactly how I wanted it to be, which, yes, may sound a bit backwards or a bit unusual. People are normally meant to focus on the focal point first, and then be guided around the image to other details via composition, colour, and a whole variety of other things that people spend ages learning about. I kind of know that if I was doing this for one of the courses that I've done in the past, I would have been told to brighten up the figure to match everything else, and to redo it so that the person is noticed first, and to maybe even reverse the vibrancy in the work so that the person is noticed first. But I wanted to experiment and break that rule. The figure is the focal point in terms of message and idea. The flowers are the focal point for what is meant to catch the eye, as they then guide the impressions in towards the ribs and what is going on there. All of this, and I did still consider changing it as I went. Even as I write this, I kind of wondered if it would just be easier to lighten the figure, to just make them a bit more vibrant, and to pass off earlier phases as a mishap that I didn't change until later. But I am happy with this, and it may still make minor adjustments to the wisps of the cavity, and I may still alter some of the other things in the image. But I really like how subtle the figure is. It is why I made the base of the painting black as well, planning it from the very beginning. So then, with all of that said, I still have some time left here to waffle on about a few things, and to kind of discuss what happened around the creation of this video. These are just one or two quick updates that I want to make note of before I get into the final summary of the painting as well. The first is that, at the end of the process, I didn't record it. I finished this painting off camera since I had commonly come to work on it later in the evening and into the late night, sometimes starting at 8 PM and stopping at midnight or 11 PM sometimes. I could do it, no issues at all, but during the final evening of recording, I got really uncomfortable and I was getting a bit agitated with the camera, my clothes, and everything at that moment. It had been a bit of a day. I wanted to keep painting though, so I made this choice to let myself change into comfier clothes, like my pyjamas, so I could get back to painting and not have to worry about recording. It meant that I turned the camera off as well, and I found that thanks to that simple change, I wasn't so agitated anymore and I could actually get the painting done. I also figured that, with where I was in the process, it would be a good little place to cut it off before the final reveal shortly. I could also fix things as needed and not really worry too much about running out of things to say in this voiceover, since I have come quite close today to running out of things. Besides all of this, I was also quite worried about making this kind of video when I started it out. I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to make in-person videos for the channel, or if I wanted to be faceless in this. I kind of figured that I would have to make this and see how I felt about uploading it. But I also knew that I would do this sooner or later, so I could share all sorts of art that I do. Digital is fun, don't get me wrong, and it is certainly quicker videos to make here, but doing that gets a bit limiting, even if it has its own perks. I mean, by the time that I was painting the flowers, I definitely was wishing that I had the copy and paste function of digital, even if I enjoyed making them all a little bit unique. So again, I also apologise for any issues in this video, as I have been learning the process to it, but I feel that it's been more fun than anything. I also have the space to make these videos now since my art has its own space, and I have room to actually make it even though I still sit on the floor when I work. It was also part of why I put off this process though. I tend to do a few weird things when painting most of the time, but I decided to simply embrace it. If it ever looks like I'm talking in the video, I was probably just singing along to music or dancing along to it as well, as it kind of keeps the process fun, and some may consider it a distraction, but it kind of keeps me more focused if anything. But with all of that said, the painting is finished and the process is done. So let's check in with the final result and actually see what the finished outcome was when all is said and done. This painting was definitely a process. It was a bit of a challenge and it had its ups and downs. But I enjoyed it either way, regardless of this, and it is something that I hope to share a bit more on this channel. I already have some more painting ideas and some more processes and different things that I want to explore now. But in other news, thank you so much for watching, and I really hope that you did enjoy this video despite how different it is. I had a few things to work out as I went along here, a few things that didn't exactly go to plan, but I still like it either way. So I hope you have a wonderful week, day, or whatever, and for now, goodbye.